right, everyone, we're going to start a new novella today. We left off last time looking at Tolstoy's little masterpiece, reflecting on the significance of death and doing it in ways that we would say in many ways are compatible with Christianity, but I suggested last time are not really particularly Christian. And if you looked at Tolstoy's own views, and you can easily do, I guess, a search on the internet for that, there's not a lot of historic sympathy with the church. In fact, he regards the church as betraying the cause of Christ, and he espoused their sort of a radical form of living, which included pacifism and living off the land, and very much he was for a church that wasn't into church, if you will, and has a lot in common with that mentality. So very much of a reactionary against authority, even though he was a count. The man we're going to look at today is rather different, as Tolstoy is a Russian writer, famous for his novellas, although War and Peace, I was talking last time to someone after the class, his great novel took place before his so-called conversion moment, but the death of Ivan Ilyich comes immediately after it. But he's writing in Russian. The writer that we're looking at today, Joseph Conrad, is writing in English, but he's an interesting character because English is not his first language. Polish is. And he does not become fluent in English, as in even speaking it fluently, until his 20s. So for those of us who are new to Canada or learning English as a second language, it's a very difficult thing to do, to learn a second language, let alone to be fluent in it. And when I say fluent, I'm not talking about the ability to interact on a personal level and make your to get things and make yourself understood, but to do it on the level of a cultural fluency as well. And I think Conrad has something of that. So extraordinary in that sense. He's an interesting fellow as well, insofar as he seems to represent in his own life much of what he depicts in his novels, because he spent a great deal of his life as a merchant seaman. Remember I said last time, and I've talked about this in the context of the Victorian era for a little while, much of Britain's power is related not just to the fact that it has an empire, but that it has a great navy. And it's the way in which it manages to defend territory that now includes pretty much a global empire, unprecedented. It had not taken place even in the context of Rome, where it would have been a mass or an empire that was largely protected by means of troops, land troops. But here it's through the means of a navy, and thus through technology in a way that it had not been in the past. Now, armies always use armament, forms of technology, spears and swords and even ballistic devices, cannon, if you will. But the idea of actually being able to move on at great distances on these enormous vessels, it's not that the Romans didn't have them, but they didn't use them really as the primary means of defending an empire, in part because they were focused in and around the Mediterranean. And most of what we now understand as the world was unknown to them. They didn't know about North America or South America. Africa they did, obviously, but weren't interested in it as far as it went south of the Saharan desert, right? Or even the Libyan desert. There are deserts there, so the north of Africa, okay, this is an area that is of interest, but south of that, why bother? Pretty much, because it's a huge desert and cuts off the Central and South Africa from Europe. Likewise, India is largely the extent of the Roman Empire. They don't get into China or Southeast Asia at all. But now we have in the context of this period, a sense that we have for the first time a sense of literature now being a global phenomenon. That's, I guess, part of the course which is of interest. We've largely focused on the West, for lack of a better term, as the context for understanding literature, and there's a tradition of reading older texts and contemporary society living in the light of that, and that becomes the context for the Christian faith as well, because Christ is born in Israel, and even in the accounts written in Scripture, Paul goes west all the way to Rome. He wants to go east, but the Holy Spirit directs him to go west. Remember, there's this moment when he is pushed to go this direction and ends up in prison in chains, and dies in Rome for that matter. So the Roman Empire is an important feature of the early dissemination of Christianity. But by this point, on our course, 19th century, that has changed. That has changed. Christianity is no longer going to be confined to the West, and it never was. It was also what we call the Eastern Christendom and so forth, which will include Tolstoy's Russia. But it will still, in that sense, be a European phenomenon. It's not yet a global phenomenon. But come the late 18th century, early 19th century, it is now a global phenomenon because of the Navy. So with the British Navy, the Christian faith starts to spread in the same way, I think, that you can see is happening under the auspices of the Roman Empire, so likewise under the British Empire. You can see that Christianity is coming to spread, and it comes to North America, obviously, but it will also then go, and those are early colonies. And so we can talk about phases of colonization. In this country, my native country, it comes in the 16th century, 17th century. Settlers, largely many escaping persecution, certainly south of the border, the Puritans. But here north of the border as well, representing a Christianity. And again, Canada's motto is from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth, Psalm 72, verse 9. Right? So it's actually part of Canada's motto. A Christian understanding of dominion and so forth is there. But it's not there in South America, it's not there in Africa, it's not, again, in East or Southeast Asia. But with the onset of the Navy and the means of circumnavigating the globe through various technological discoveries, that's now changed. And so, among others, we get the great Baptist missionary movement beginning in India and also in Africa. You know, in David Livingstone in Africa, in India, I'm just drawing a blank. What's his name? William Carey brings the gospel to India, and with it translates the Bible into the native languages there and transforms the culture, quite frankly. William Carey's an extraordinary figure. And so the early missionaries are doing what the early Christian missionaries do, and they're simply bringing the gospel. And that's what they're doing. They're going there, they're feeding the poor, they're rectifying injustice. I mean, Carey brings about an agricultural revolution, technological revolution. He brings in schools. He brings in hospitals, hospices. He opposes the astrology, which marks the Indian life. He opposes the caste system. Everyone is a human being. The gospel is for everyone. It's not for the priestly caste. It's for all, and it has a transformative effect. Likewise, in Africa, David Livingstone brings the gospel. However, that's not the only context. There's also the dark side of imperialism in this period, and that is marked by the period that Conrad is describing in Heart of Darkness. And it's marked by an historic event in 1870 called the Scramble for Africa. This is what historians call it. I'll put the map up on the screen here if I can. Actually, it might take a second now because I've probably blanked it for too long. Let's see. I have, in fact. But I hear it warming. Oh, there it is. So there's the Scramble for Africa diagram. And what I have on the map here is a map of Africa and all of the colonies that were scrambled after from 1870 onwards. So when we think of the relation of the West, of Europe, of North America to the continent of Africa, we tend to think of the African slave trade. But by the time the Scramble for Africa has happened, the slave trade is done. It's in the British Empire. It's been abolished in the early 19th century. William Wilberforce and others fought for the abolition of that. And in the United States, a civil war was fought over it. Right, and it's done by this point. It's finished. But the Scramble for Africa takes place still after that, for the purpose of gaining property for the various countries in Europe. And so again, slavery is abolished, but the movement to colonize comes right after it. Right after it's been abolished, still that happens. And that's the context of Conrad's little novella, Heart of Darkness. And what we're going to find in this is that Conrad uses many of the terms that we would associate with Christianity throughout it. It's littered with references there that will suggest that the narrator, Marlowe, is a Christian and uses the vocabulary of Christianity, and yet what he does and what the colonial powers do in scrambling for Africa and bringing it under the dominion of the European states is not particularly Christian. And so we have a very troubling phenomenon here in Heart of Darkness, which I'm not sure we've altogether come to grips with in terms of what goes on here. To this day, Christianity is associated in the popular mind with oppression, with racism even, with evil, outright. Now this is a narrative that I don't ascribe to, but it's a very popular narrative. And it isn't only an association with the slave trade, although the association with the slave trade is obviously connected with a Christian past. But note that it was abolished by Christians, and it was fought by Christians, and it was even to the point in the south of the border, Christians died on both sides of the fight, but the fight was over exactly that. It was over the humanity of the individuals who happened to be dark-skinned. And they could not be regarded as chattel slaves. That was what the fight was over. And it was fought from the north by those that happened to believe that this was against the Bible to treat people as slaves and property, because you were treating them as things rather than people. So the basic idea of human nature was at stake in that fight. Wilberforce said it, the abolitionists in Britain said it, and so did our cousins to the south when they fought a war over it. And as I say, 500,000 at least died in that war. And the consequences reverberate to this very day, I think. South of the border, the politics and so forth is still, there's tension over that fight, because it's not just the fact that there were, that slavery itself was a terrible, wicked scar on the nation's face. It's that there was a civil war, and civil wars the marks of a civil war do not go away from a country quickly. When you get your own countrymen fighting against you, even when you stop fighting, that doesn't go away, because families are divided and the wounds don't go away. Look at what happens in Eastern Europe and the Balkans and so forth. They talk about fights from centuries past, and they talk about it as if it were a present reality, and that's because in a sense it is. So a great deal of complexity in the situation here. But I want to pay attention to Conrad's depiction of it. I'm not just interested in the history per se. I'm interested here, although that is interesting, in how Conrad portrays this struggle. And in general, this text is seen as one of the classics of Western literature, Heart of Darkness. And one of the problems with it has been that some contend that it is a colonialist text, that it effectively perpetrates a colonialist mindset. That is, it portrays the Africans as subhuman, and thereby contradicts, among other things, the Christian faith. But certainly the legacy of the West that would regard each individual as bearing the imago Dei and having an integrity, and they can't be treated as property. So some see it as a text of colonialism, and I think there's a case to be made for that. But that was certainly the case that Chinua Achebe made, the Nigerian novelist. He said the Africans are portrayed basically as animals, or not much better than. They're dehumanized. A different reading of it, and I'm more sympathetic to this, although I understand the case that's being made, because it's quite frankly patently obvious. Yes, the Africans are being depicted through the eyes of Marlowe, the protagonist, as being inferior to him. But that's the point. He's critiquing from within the mindset of the European powers. There's a critique of it, and it's it's not the point of satirizing the way Swift does. And maybe I'm just naive about this, and it's just outright colonialist, and that's the end of it, but I don't think so. I think there's enough subtlety there and complexity so that we don't trust the narrator. We don't trust the narrator. It's not the omniscient perspective. So part of the concern here then is narrative perspective. The narrator is Marlowe. He is a sailor. He's a sailor like Conrad himself. He's going to become the captain of a ship. He'll go into the Congo which is occupied by Belgium. He's going to have to, although he's British, he's going to have to go to Belgium, to the city of Brussels, which is described as a whitewashed sepulcher, which sounds to me pretty critical. It's what Jesus said about the Pharisees. So he's calling the Brussels Pharisees, but he himself goes there and flies ends up captaining a ship under the banner of the Belgians. So if it is a whitewashed sepulcher, what does that make Marlowe? Is he not on side with them? And as far as the colonialist mindset goes, he's going to meet a man by the name of Kurtz, who is there to exploit the country. The purpose of his going there is to get ivory. That's why they go into the Congo. The Congo has obviously this jungle, which I think most people know about, but maybe they don't. The Congo is filled with rainforest. It's just impenetrable, dark. And in that sense, it is the heart of darkness. This is a map from 1914, when it's all colonized. If you looked at the map from 1870 or 60 or thereabouts, you would find that there was a patch in the middle that it was terra incognita. It had not yet been explored even. Because how do you get into that thick interior when it's filled with jungle and impenetrable, basically impossible to see? They don't have drones that they can send over, or satellites they can map from above. You have to actually walk into it and describe it from within. And who lives there? Well, there are people that live there, actually. But they're not European, and very difficult to go there. And no reason to go there, except then they find that there's something there in the Congo which they want, and what they want is ivory. What do you need ivory for? What do you think? What do you associate with ivory? Yeah. Pianos. The keys of a piano. There you go. See them? Nice white keys. It's a very sophisticated mark of Western culture. It's not an ancient instrument at all. It's relatively modern. And the keys are made of ivory, overlaid, right? You just you can pull the ivory off it even. But those are taken from elephant tusks, just the tusks. and so they're also used for, I mean, this was mentioned in The Rape of the Lock, they're used for combs and so forth, and little sophisticated, they're highly coveted as a cultural good. And so the scramble for Africa in this case is not just for territory, but it's for a symbol of Western culture. And there's a great deal of irony in this understanding of Western culture related to harvesting the tusks of elephants. And it's a very difficult novella. It's almost like the jungle that Conrad goes into. It is hard to follow, I will say. So if you're reading it, you'll say this is a great, Masson says this is a great novel, but you're reading it and thinking, it's actually hard going, reading it. And there's a bit of, because it's not clear what's going on, there's a bit of obscurity. He says one thing and he seems to contradict it, and there are multiple figures, and the main character, Marlowe, seems to be revered by certain people, but the narrative voice that isn't Marlowe seems to criticize Marlowe and throw suspicion on whether we ought to trust him. And the whole novella begins in a fog on the River Thames. And it starts talking about the Roman Empire and talking about the atrocities of the Roman Empire, and how the fact that Britain itself once used to be a colony of the Roman Empire, back when the Britons were there and they were savages, and the poor Romans had to row north on their ships, triremes, and go into a country which is cold and dark. This was once one of the dark places of the earth, says Marlowe. And now what is it? Well, it's the centerpiece of civilization, the city of London, just like Paris, because the two powers of the 19th century are centered on Paris and London. It's what Dickens describes in The Tale of Two Cities, Paris and London. And they are two of the colonial powers that have scrambled for Africa, alongside, as you can see, not just Britain and France, although those are the main two, but Germany, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, and Spain. The Western European powers that also colonized Latin America, South America, and also Asia. And how did they do it? In each case, they did it through a navy. But the British have the best navy by this point. And they have, because of the Industrial Revolution, further solidified their gains. And they're doing it now, but here's the question, and it's a double context. The Christian faith has gone out into Africa, it's gone into Asia, it's gone into India, it's gone to South America with Christian missionaries. But alongside the Christian missionaries, others have gone that are helping them, but they have a different agenda. It's not that of sharing the gospel as beggars to other beggars. We're servants of the Most High God. We are equals in that sense. I'm sharing it with you because of the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations. That's my motivation. Others are going there for a different motivation, and the motivation is exploitation, domination. And yet, those people use Christian language to describe what they're doing. They use the veneer of Christianity, like the keys on the piano. It's the ivory on top of the very sordid machinery that's going on underneath. That's there for the purpose of exploitation and enrichment. The other thing that comes up at the time, and he doesn't mention it explicitly as far as I recall, but we now have a new theory of human nature. Darwin, Origin of the Species, talks about human nature in ways that are compatible with the 18th century view of humanity beginning in primitive fashions and over time developing civilization. We talked about that in relation to the Romantics, recall. How they saw the early natives as savages. They had great poetry. They expressed themselves emotively, powerfully. And yet, as time went by, the philosophers came and they told myths and legends, but as time went by, the philosophers came in and critiqued the legends and said this can't possibly be true. there's a better way of looking at it. Remember, we looked at Plato's allegory of the cave, and they brought reason into the mix. So reason then succeeded the age of poetry. And with this, religion was also critiqued by the philosophers. Well, eventually you come to the 17th, 18th, and the 19th century, and now we're in the scientific age. The Romantics are very critical of the scientific age. They say that there's something of humanity that is crushed by the Enlightenment, and its cookie-cutter approach to humanity and its cookie-cutter approach to nature. Remember the Palace of Versailles, the way it approaches nature, and it tries to make everything fit into a rational template. The Romantics protest that it's not just that you are desecrating nature, you're also desecrating humanity. Remember, we said that Swift was a critic of that, and we saw that in The Modest Proposal. Well, this is an extension of that critique as far as I'm concerned, whether it's intentional on Conrad's part, which I think it is, or it's inadvertent. I still think we can see a stark questioning of the colonialist enterprise, which is the backdrop, at the very least, for the novella, because it is set in the Belgian Congo, which at this point is not, it's under Belgian rule, so it is a yellow spot on the map. And yet it hasn't actually been chartered so that they know the whole extent of what constitutes the Congo. Comments or questions at this point? We'll get into the novel now. I just wanted to set the stage, give you a sense of the backdrop. Yes?
The first thing that I noticed that kind of shed some suspicion on Marlowe is even just how he was talking about his desire to discover a place, and where he mentioned that as soon as he figured out a place was discovered, all of a sudden that place held no interest.
Held no interest any longer.
So it wasn't so much, he had no concern for the place itself, only what he could do in discovering it.
Yes, that's right. Yes, so it's very interesting. And again, this is one of the things I agree makes us suspicious of the narrator. Now, we're not used to this having an unreliable narrator. And when I say unreliable, morally unreliable. His moral compass is not necessarily trustworthy. He has trust because he is a captain of a ship, and we associate the captains of ships with all sorts of respectable forms of authority. You know, they have to give orders to others. They're in charge. They're in control. We think that they represent progress and civilization. After all, the sailors of the colonialist period did exactly that. Christopher Columbus and others went, and of course we associate grand victories of them. Well, he talks about those actually in speaking of the River Thames. How many explorers have left London and gone all over the world and brought with them civilization? And he wants to do the same, but he doesn't want to go anywhere where somebody else has gone. So he's a bit like James T. Kirk in Star Trek, to boldly go where no man has gone before. I want to go where no Western man has ever gone, and if somebody has gone there, I'm not interested in that. A parallel novel for this, which I haven't put on the course, and I told you because of length, is Frankenstein, which is the exact same phenomenon. The scientific mindset of the Enlightenment wants to go wherever people have not gone before, and to bring it under a sort of dominion. And they see it as a process of enlightenment. We're bringing light to the world, which is in darkness. We're going to bring the Enlightenment with us. Even Tolstoy's novella suggested that, or at least Tolstoy's broader fiction suggests it, because the aristocrats speak in French, and French is the language of the Enlightenment. In War and Peace, they converse in French to one another. It's connected with improvement, progress, enlightenment. And yet, we have reason as the reader, I think, to suspect that the narrator is not entirely trustworthy, because his motives don't seem to be particularly admirable. He's just an adventurer. In some ways, he's a simple man, but he's not regarded that way. by his contemporaries. They don't regard him in suspicion. But the question is, does the narrative of the group of Europeans, which they all agree on, it's okay to do this, nothing wrong with this, do we, the reader, share their assessment of it, or does Conrad give us reason to distrust the group narrative? And I think he gives us reason to distrust it. And that's why I say it's a critique of colonialism, not an expression of colonialism, although it's both. So the company that goes into Belgium, they are colonialists. And they express themselves as colonialists. And that includes Conrad. When he describes the Africans, he's talking like a colonialist. He's talking about the Africans as subhuman. He's talking them as less developed, less evolved, like a Darwinist would. Right? These are subhuman people. It's not a Christian point of view. The problem is that he still uses the vocabulary of Christianity, which he has inherited from his own language and his own culture. But he doesn't believe in it, because otherwise he wouldn't think of the Africans that way, and he wouldn't talk about the Africans that way, and he wouldn't be willing to do what he ends up doing. And he would not, above all, admire the man who's at the center of the Heart of Darkness, whose name is Kurtz, who is a man that Marlowe admires because he is dedicated to efficiency, and he's not going to be restrained by any moral considerations. He's going to get the job done. And this is what Marlowe says distinguishes his contemporary age from the Romans, is a dedication to efficiency. He says that very explicitly. The Romans would come along, take a territory, plunder it, and they wouldn't care really about staying there per se. They just wanted some stuff. It's just like robbers, not much different. Whereas we bring with it Western civilization, a commitment to progress, and we are absolutely committed to it, and we will allow no resistance. It's not just smash and grab, it's stay and transform. But what is the transformation? Is it the transformation of the gospel, which is to bring the kingdom of God all over the earth, and to reach out to the sick, the widow, and the orphan? Is it that, or is it to benefit the people that are going there? And I think it's abundantly clear from Marlowe's depiction that the colonialists are not motivated by Christian motives, although they still talk in semi-Christian terms. Does anyone agree or disagree, or do you see points of... I'll come to the text right now, and we'll try and substantiate what I've said here. I just want to give you a brief overview, because when we get into into reading the novella, you can sort of get lost, like I said, in the depiction. But let me at least get into that now. I'm going to stop.